Hey, this is Ryan Clancy here with another edition of No Labels Talks with my buddy Holly Page. Holly, what's going on?
Hey Ryan, how are you this last day of May?
I am good. I am good. Another eventful week, actually, for our community too. We had a big win for one of our allies down in Texas. Tony Gonzalez, really a great member who was getting a far-right primary challenge from just right-wing flamethrower. And Gonzalez won, thanks in no small part to support from people out there in our community. So that's a positive.
It was a huge, I think, victory for common sense. Basically, his big crime was that he was willing to talk to the other side, to talk to Democrats and work on the border funding bill that, of course, the Republican Senator Langford actually led. And thank goodness he survived that.
Yeah, it was that, and of course his district unfortunately includes Uvalde, which had that horrific shooting, and he came out for stronger gun safety measures. And in fact, the guy who challenged him was a YouTube guns rights advocate. And in any case, it was a close election, and he won. And look, I think he only won by a couple hundred votes.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's the kind of thing, and you and I were actually talking about this before we got on, it's the kind of thing that reminds you that when you give $20, when you come out to vote, it actually really does make a difference.
There is a reason that the Supreme Court equates political donations with free speech, because it is a way of communicating. And we saw that again with the verdict in President Trump's trial and the overwhelming contributions that actually crashed his site to process donations was enormous. And I think one of the things that No Labels is really trying to convey is to our voters, the common sense majority, we need to engage in politics in the way that the politicians value. And voting, especially in a turnout, a runoff election situation like Tony Gonzalez faced, or a primary, not just the general, and giving small dollar contributions are the two ways that are most valued and understood, really, by Washington politicians.
It is important. It's especially important because if you look at the list of the top members of Congress who get the most small dollar donations, it is almost universally the worst members. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, gets the biggest share of her donations by percentage, small dollar donations, of any member of Congress. Also on that top list is, Matt Gaetz is on there. There's a couple left-wing people on there, like super, far left people. Okay, so that's the problem, right? Like if you just think about pure incentives, if Marjorie Taylor Greene understands, boy, I can raise a boatload of money by just being outrageous and throwing sand in the gears all the time, well, they're going to do more of it. And so you got to, if you don't like that, you got to counter it.
Exactly. I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene not only has the largest percentage of small dollar donors, she raised more money than any other member of the House and Senate in this cycle so far. And I think of it that her small dollar contributors have purchased her independence, have purchased her the right to, or the ability anyway, to stand on the steps of the Capitol moments after the Ukraine funding vote, for example, and say that she's gonna, bump off the speaker. I mean,
Yep.
it's that was unthinkable 10 years ago. And so we need to, as a community, invest in this, a similar thing, but do it for people who are going to use their independent thinking and ability in the best interest of their communities and the country.
Well, look, she is she is an independent thinker. I will give her that. But not really the kind of independent thinker that we tend to support. The one that we tend to support is actually somebody who just today announced he's formally becoming an independent. Joe Manchin, like Kirsten Sinema before him, said he's leaving the Democratic Party.
really, he probably did that mentally a long time ago. This is
Yeah.
just the formality of it. But I think, he really has always, in my experience of him, puts the people of West Virginia first and foremost. And he doesn't care where the idea comes from or who's aligned with it. If he thinks it's good for the people of West Virginia, he's going to support it or oppose it. And so I think his timing was very interesting though, and I can't wait to see if there's more to the story with him. Because apparently this was the last day that he could change his party affiliation before some offices in West Virginia to file to run. I can't believe he'd want to go back to the State House, but it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah. Well, look, we a lot of interesting political developments here. But we lose sight of this sometimes. We focus on the horse race. But it is outside our borders getting a lot more dangerous by the day, unfortunately. And that's really the focus of No Labels Talks this week. Last week, we got a chance to speak to Seth Cropsey from the Yorktown Institute, regular columnist for the Wall Street Journal. This week, we get a chance to speak with another great thinker, Kori Schake from the American Enterprise Institute, who has just really done a lot of amazing thinking about America's place in the world. And as people will hear, if they give a listen here, she does not feel too good about where we're heading on the foreign policy front.
It was a terrific conversation, and she said a lot of really, I thought, important and interesting things, and particularly her last answer to your final question. So we won't, I don't even want to say the word. We won't spoil it for people, but we will, but I encourage people to listen to it all the way through because she's got quite a pointed answer to a question that you asked, and it was really interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, we want everybody to listen all the way through. Don't do the thing I do with podcasts, which is you just fast forward through parts. So don't try to get away with that. Just go into the last
Only 30 minutes, that's like, yeah. Drive to and from the grocery store or something.
All right. Well, with that, everybody enjoyed this week's edition of No Labels Talks. Hi, this is Brian Clancy with No Labels, and we are here for another edition of No Labels Talks. And with me today is Dr. Kori Schake, who is a senior fellow and director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She's written 5 books, countless articles, and is one of the country's best foreign policy thinkers, as well as a practitioner who's had senior roles at the State Department, Defense, and National Security Council. Dr. Schake, thank you very much for joining us.
It is such a pleasure.
So I have to start with the thing that is impossible not to talk about, which is just yesterday, of course, we had the verdict in the trial of former President Trump in New York with the business cases record, found guilty on 34 counts. You've talked about how just the act of former President Trump being on trial sends a pretty significant message to our enemies and allies abroad. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Sure. It's a nice demonstration of the rule of law in America, that even the country's most powerful people stand before justice, stand before juries of their peers. To get 12 people unanimous on 34 separate counts, I think sends a very positive signal. All of that, though, is preparation for saying if Americans re-elect President Trump after this, it will, I think, shock the sensibilities of America's closest friends and will give grist for the Chinese argument about the degeneracy of American power and of American dominance of the order.
Now, Dr. Schake, you know the counter to this in terms of the message it sends abroad, which goes something like this. Actually, the message this sends is that we now prosecute our political enemies, because here you have a liberal prosecutor in Manhattan, pretty liberal place, convicting a former president. What would your response be to that?
Well, my response to that would be, you either think the legal system works to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, or you don't. I thought it was interesting, actually, that you all probably saw the chart of where the 12 jurors got their information. And it was striking that one of the 12 that joined in unanimity, the only place they got their information was from Truth Social, President Trump's own media empire, and yet they were persuaded. So I think, I have to say, it deeply disappoints me to see the leadership of my fellow Republicans making the argument that the courts aren't legitimate. I personally believe conservatives are institutionalists, that's how you legitimately constrain power. So it grieves me to see the leadership of my political party making the argument that the courts can't be trusted to produce justice.
And of course, and I know we noted this at the top, but you have spent your career working at conservative policy institutions and Republican administrations. One of the things you wrote about earlier this year, and you actually echoed something Mitch McConnell said, who said he was going to devote the rest of his time in the Senate to upholding Republican internationalism. And you wrote an article about conservative internationalism, foreign affairs, and why you think that's so important. So what is that conservative internationalism, and how does that contrast with maybe the feelings of President Trump, former President Trump, on foreign policy?
Yeah, so I think conservative internationalism is recognizable by the presidents who practice it. Eisenhower and Reagan, probably the two foremost. So who believe in deterring war by keeping a very strong American military, who believe in an America engaged in the world. As the great George Shultz used to describe it, diplomacy is tending the garden so that weeds don't sink roots. It's trade policy that believes that a level playing field benefits us all. And so market access and arrangements that facilitate trade are advantageous for us. That alliances, in particular alliances with like-minded countries, but not just with like-minded countries, that we can also and should also make commitments to regional actors who share our interests, even if they don't share our values, because we are not a large enough community of free societies to be able to protect and advance our interests enough by just relying on the people who think like we do. And of course, as Jim Mattis so often points out to me, we are often wrong ourselves.
Right. Well, what the approach you just described was very much the dominant philosophy of President Reagan and former President Bush, certainly. But former President Trump has taken a departure of that in many ways. Why do you think that is the case, that we suddenly see some Republicans questioning some of these assumptions? I think for a lot of people, the moment where it became obvious something had changed was the debate over aid to Ukraine. It would have just been assumed years ago that Republicans would have got behind that, and they didn't a lot of them.
It's a great question. And I think there are two drivers that destabilized kind of 70 years of Republican consensus on international issues. And one is the mistakes in both the decisions and the conduct of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that cast a long shadow, and those mistakes should cast a long shadow over Americans' trust of people like me. And the second is allowing China to come into the international economic order without requiring it to play by the rules that other countries play by in the international economic order. And the effect that that had on the American and other developed economies. I think that's what collapses support for trade and support for a more engaged internationalism. But what I find when I talk to Rotary clubs and I talk to congressional town halls and others beyond the Beltway crowds is that what helps Americans understand the importance of a return to conservative internationalism is to remind them that if we don't set and enforce the rules of order, China and Russia are going to set those rules. And what it looks like is the kind of pressure Taiwan is under, and it looks like strong powers like Russia and China creating zones of influence that remove the autonomy, the sovereignty of their neighbors. And the US will be probably the last country to be affected by that, but we will eventually be affected by that. The rule of law will collapse, recourse for commercial transactions gone bad will collapse internationally. The rules of debt financing, as we saw in the case of Zambia, when they became insolvent and the Chinese government demanded to be the first creditor repaid.
You know, I want to get your sense for how perilous you think this moment is or isn't. I was speaking last week actually with Seth Cropsey from the Yorktown Institute. I'm sure you're familiar with him. And he said today really reminds him of the 1930s, only instead of Germany, Italy, and Japan threatening the world, we have Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea just much more directly threatening the United States and the order we built after World War II. Do you see the same parallels?
I do. I think the deepening collusion between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and the potential for that to extend to other states, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, Niger, if we don't practice better international policy, I think those are real dangers. And the second thing that makes this moment incredibly dangerous is that we have a two-war strategy and a one-war military. We are dramatically under-resourcing our international obligations. You know, we complain about Europeans taking a peace dividend. The US has been taking one too. And we probably need at least 5 and probably 6% of GDP going into defense in order to rebuild our defense industrial base. You know, China now has 390 ships in its Navy. 370 ships in its Navy. The US has 290. That's not a margin of error that Americans should feel comfortable with, given the friction we in China have over what the rules of international order should be.
But I want to emphasize here what you just described. So 6% of GDP going towards defense spending, which is about where it was during the Cold War at certain points, certainly in the 80s. But that is about twice what we're spending right now. And if you look at the budget that President Biden has put forth, it does not call for anything like that, close to an increase. I mean, I'm curious, where do you think the political will for this needs to come from? Because we have, I guess what I'm getting is, how do you juggle this tension between, we have such significant fiscal problems right now. The country is racking up $1 trillion in debt every 100 days now. I'm sure you've seen, we now are going to spend more on interest payments alone this year than we are on national defense. How in that context does a president make the case for doubling the defense budget, and what does that mean has to happen elsewhere? Do we need tax increases? Do we need to cut spending elsewhere?
In 3 ways. First, which is, we don't get to choose what threats we face in the world. The world is objectively getting more dangerous for America's interests, and that requires of us to do different and better than we are doing. So that's where it starts. The second place is that, you know, we need to have an honest conversation about the drivers of American debt. the driver of American insolvency is entitlement spending. It is crowding out discretionary spending of all kinds. Two of the Republican candidates for president this time braved up to say we need entitlement reform in order to bring American spending back under control. And I really strongly support that position, because there's no way you even sustain the 1% over inflation growth in defense that the Biden budget produces, which is in itself wholly inadequate for the challenges, without entitlement reform. And so I think that's a hugely important test, in particular for conservatives. And the third thing is economic growth is the answer to everything.
Right.
The more you change the denominator, the less the numerator, right? Like we know how to do this, and growing the economy is the easiest way to solve this problem.
Well, we've got a big problem with number two, though, which is, and you know, most people who follow budget issues know this. The root of our whole budget has to do with, we have a society that's aging and living longer, and that's wonderful. But with 10,000 people, you know, retiring every day, over time, a lot more is going to Social Security and Medicare. President Biden and former President Trump are already on the record saying they will not touch either of those things if they are elected.
Yeah, and yet Congress has the ability to do it with or without the president. They are the initiators of legislation. They are the people who control the money. And so there's no substitute for winning the political argument that will drive congressional action and eventually drag whoever gets elected president along to do what the country actually needs to have done.
How would you judge how the Biden administration is doing relative to the challenges you just described? So, you know, you agreed with the sentiment that this is in a lot of ways, a 1930s moment. Do you think they're behaving accordingly?
No. I mean, their defense budget alone tells you the answer to that. Congress added $27 billion to the first Biden defense budget. They added $45 billion to the second defense budget. Senator Wicker, the ranking Republican on Senate Armed Services, just released a defense strategy that would add an additional $50 billion to this year's defense budget. So I think on a bipartisan basis, Congress has delivered a verdict on the adequacy of Biden administration resourcing for it. But it's not just resourcing. For example, the Biden administration signed an agreement with Australia and Britain, the AUKUS agreement, in order to fulfill the responsibilities of that obligation. The United States needs to produce 2.3 submarines a year. The Biden administration does not include that in their own defense budget. So, you know, they are failing their responsibilities. And in a third way in which I think they are failing their responsibilities is that every time the president wrings his hands and stalls on assistance to Ukraine because he doesn't want to start World War III, he tells our adversaries what we are afraid of, instead of acknowledging that we are the dominant power in the international order and we should be deterring Russia and other countries, not ourselves, letting ourselves be deterred by projecting our anxiety and telling our enemies what we will not do. So I give them a solid C on addressing the challenges of our moment.
Do you think you know
I'm sorry, can I make the rubble bounce with a fourth element on this?
Of course you
which is that, you know, American strategy is overweighted on its military elements because the Biden administration they are genuinely protectionist. They don't believe in market access, and therefore we don't we're not giving America's friends what they are pleading for, which is an economic vision that helps all of us reduce our reliance on China. That is what America's friends around the world are yearning for. And the Biden administration is completely missing in action on that.
So that was one thing I wanted to ask you about is, historically, a lot of presidents have been associated with some kind of doctrine, be it the Bush doctrine that was really about, prosecuting the war on terror, even going back to the Monroe Doctrine, which was basically telling the Europeans to stay out of our backyard here in the Western Hemisphere. What, as far as you can tell, is the Biden doctrine? Do they have one?
So the White House would say they do have one. And they would say it is democracy, advancing democracy at home and abroad. And they profess to do that by reducing the reliance on military force in American grand strategy. But the problem is, if you don't have an economic strategy, and you are alienating potential partners by democracy promotion in the way they are doing it, right? Then you are left to rely on the military elements of the strategy. And so they're just bad at strategy.
Well, that's one thing that for all the differences that Trump and Biden have, they have both been very keen on using tariffs to not only shut out Chinese products and stuff. I mean, in some cases, they're levying those on European countries and elsewhere.
They invoked the national security clause, the Trump administration, against Canada, and the Biden administration has left it in place. Look, I think there is a place for targeted tariffs. Some of the tariffs that are being imposed on China in specific technological areas, I think those can be important for protecting intellectual property, for penalizing China's attempts to corner international markets. But in general, big sloppy tariff policy tends to be bad international economic policy.
Right. Well, I mean, do you think, if we look at China in particular, do you think the administration is making the right decisions to counter them?
I think they're making some of the right decisions. I think the excellence of their approach to China has been expanding cooperation with countries that are China's neighbors, the basing arrangements with the Philippines, the reconciliation with Vietnam, the expansion of cooperation with Australia, the encouragement to Japan to take a more active role in its own defense. I think there they have done an excellent job. But again, they didn't rejoin the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. They haven't ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Those are the two things that America's allies in Asia look at as demonstrations of our commitment and our seriousness in managing the China problem in ways that they can support.
You mentioned how democracy promotion is a big part of the administration's agenda, but it sounds like, if I'm reading between the lines, are other countries often reading that as us just hectoring them about how they're supposed to be better on democracy or civil rights or women's rights and things like that?
Yes. We are losing the art of winning wars because we lard our strategy with so many conflicting objectives. If you can either have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, which matters for global energy prices and matters for some aspects of managing China, or you can say, I'm going to make the Crown Prince an international pariah. But you can't have both of those things simultaneously. And the Biden administration makes a lot of those kinds of mistakes of making reckless statements that are insulting to countries whose cooperation we need for important national security objectives for the United States. The second thing, this isn't a stellar moment for the United States to be thumping our chest about other people's democracies. And so, we ought to approach it with more humility. And I like the way Tamara Kaufman-Wittes, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, or the National Democratic Institute, talks about it, which is all of us have work to do. And let's talk about how we do that work.
Well, what do you think people could expect as a break? I mean, we just talked about, the kind of core elements of the current administration's policy. Where do you think the most significant breaks would happen if Trump wins in November? So right out of the gate, what are a couple things that you would instantly notice as shifts as it relates to foreign policy? And maybe also, where might there be some areas of continuity where actually the administration might carry over what's going on now?
So I think the biggest shift will be if President Trump is reelected, is that all of us will have to price in an enormous chaos premium, because it's very difficult to predict where President Trump will come down on anything other than narrow personal vendettas. And so people will be scrambling for access, that you'll have the problem of the last briefer determining policy, and the kinds of people the president's likely to put in cabinet positions aren't going to be John Kelly and Jim Mattis. They're going to be people who are working very hard to carry out whatever the president's proclivities are, and are less likely to feel constrained by institutional and normative practices. And so I think it's going to be messy. That'll be the biggest difference. And the corners of the tent won't feel nailed down very well. Things will be around.
Okay, well, one substantive difference, obviously, when the Biden administration came in is, the approach to the Middle East. The Trump administration very much put Iran in the penalty box, walked away from the nuclear deal, reimposed sanctions, and of course pursued the Abraham Accords with the other Gulf states to normalize relations with Israel. President Biden comes in, tries to revive the deal, and loosen some of the strictures on Iran to maybe entice them back to the table. Doesn't look like that's worked out so well. What do you think would happen as it relates to our Middle East policy if Trump were to come in?
So I think I would make a distinction between Iran policy, which I agree with you, was a failure in both the Trump and in the Biden administrations, right? They had near opposite approaches. President Trump dramatically driving up the pressure on Iran, and the Biden administration dramatically driving it down. I mean, we're about to object to an IA, International Atomic Energy Agency report critical of Iran. The Biden administration and Europeans are backing it, and we're about to dissent because we're trying to ignore Iran. So I think both Trump and Biden administration policies on Iran were quite bad, but they were just bad in different ways. On broader Middle East policy, I agree with your judgment that the Abraham Accords were a really interesting and important innovation, and capitalize on the concern that countries in the region have about Iran and about the growing possibility of cooperation between the countries of the Gulf, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel. I think, frankly, those aspirations have been set back in the Biden administration, in part because President Biden so obviously wanted the Middle East not to matter. And of course, that's a bad judgment strategically, and he's been dragged back into dealing with the problems of the region, because you can either ignore the region or you can help solve its problems. And now he's jumped in with both feet in ways that I think he mistakenly thought he would have more influence over Israel than he has had. We're not paying nearly enough attention to the prospect for Jordan slowly sinking under pressure from Iran and other malign sources. So the Middle East is messy right now. I don't anticipate that a Trump administration will have a much better or more cohesive Middle East policy. I just think it will be bad in different ways.
One question you got earlier about the IEA, or IAEA, which is the International Nuclear Agency, and Britain and France want to rebuke Iran for violating their promise not to develop their nuclear program. And as you mentioned, the Biden administration is apparently prevailing upon them not to do that. What is your understanding of why they're doing that? The cynical take is they just want to keep a lid on the region until November and not mess around with the election. Is there something else happening though, that is maybe a more charitable view of why they might be doing that?
I can think of two possibilities. So I should say, I don't know the answer, but I can think of two possibilities. One is that with the death of Iran's president and foreign minister, that they may feel this is a very unstable time in Iranian domestic politics, and pressure from outside on the nuclear program may embolden the most intractable elements, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, in the internal power struggle. That might be one reason. I think it's a bad judgment, but I could see them making that judgment. And the second is that the Biden administration's overriding strategic reflex is fear of escalation. You see it in dealing with Taiwan, you see it dealing with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and I think you see it all over the Middle East. And they may view legitimate international pressure on Iran's nuclear progress as escalating the problem into something they have to deal with.
I have just two final questions for you. One of which came from one of the folks in our community, Judy Shield from Charlotte, North Carolina, had a question about Israel, which was this. When you think about what to do over there in Israel, in Gaza, how do you untangle the historical claims of the land, which is both Jews and Arabs have a story about how parts of the land over there are theirs. Whether you go back decades, whether you go back hundreds of years, thousands of years. I mean, how much should those historical claims impact how a president thinks about dealing with that region today? Or is that not just really relevant, and you just have to look more at the facts on the ground and deal with it as it is?
So there is no avoiding the stories that people tell themselves about the legitimacy of their political objectives. So I think you have to acknowledge that Palestinians tell themselves a story that starts with the creation of the State of Israel. And Israelis' story is very different. In fact, the Roman Empire would tell a different story about that as well. But you have to deal with both of them. There's no avoiding the political culture that it creates in both countries. My sense is that the problems, in particular the violence in Gaza, is bad, and it's going to stay bad for a long time, because both parties have a zero-sum story that they hold dear that is incompatible with each other. And a second reason it's going to stay bad is because, we have, again, it goes back to the point that we're losing our conception of what warfare is like. There's so much condemnation of the Israeli conduct of the war, as though warfare is somehow magically antiseptic, and Hamas militants can hide among civilians, and somehow they should be protected when they do that. The Geneva Conventions and the US Labor Code that becomes the Uniform Code of Military Justice permits the targeting of civilians if it is central to the political objectives of the war. And that's even further than Israel has gone. So I think in part, the misunderstanding about how brutal, how visceral, and how permissive environments warfare is a big part of why this is so fraught at the moment.
I want to just close with this final question, which is, we have at the end of this coming month here, the first debate. So for now, at least, President Biden and former President Trump have agreed. And of course, we have another one coming up in September. If you were moderating and you could just ask them a single question, be it one question for both of them or a question individually targeted to each, I'm curious what it would be.
How do you plan to afford what you think is necessary for the country to do?
Fascinating. So that really pulls together that discussion we were having earlier about the need to kind of expend more resources on the military, but the fiscal constraints that we're operating under. Okay, so that you've laid down a mark. We can hope that question will get asked. Dr. Schake, thank you so much for taking some time with us here on a Friday afternoon.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you everybody for listening, and tune in next time for our next edition of No Labels Talks. In the meantime, everybody have a great week.